Last Thursday on South Padre Island, Texas, a packed conference room filled with some of the sharpest minds in tropical meteorology sat in anticipation. At 9 a.m. sharp, the room went quiet. Dozens of meteorologists pulled out their phones and started recording. They knew what was coming, and they were ready. This is the moment Dr. Phil Klotzbach works toward all year. He stepped on stage and delivered his hurricane season outlook for 2026.
Our first forecast that just went live is for a total of 13 named storms, 6 hurricanes, 2 major hurricanes. Those are Cat 3, 4, 5 on the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale.
Below average. And the reason? El Niño is coming. Possibly a strong one. But there's more to it than that. I caught up with Phil right after that presentation, and we had a conversation that goes a lot deeper than the headline numbers.
So just because models are generally very aggressive doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's going to occur.
We talk about what El Niño actually does to a hurricane season, and maybe more importantly, where storms tend to go when El Niño is in control versus when La Niña takes over.
And so typically El Niño really knocks down your storm formations, especially in the Caribbean and also in the tropical Atlantics.
We get into the history behind this forecast, now in its 43rd year, and what it meant for Phil to take over from the legendary Dr. Bill Gray. And we dig into the other factors quietly in play this season. Because for the people living along the coast, a seasonal outlook is more than just numbers. The forecast is big picture, but the impact is very personal. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie, and you're listening to Off the Radar, a production of the National Weather Desk. On the show, we dig deep into topics about weather, climate, the ocean, space, and much more. Our goal is to help you understand the weather and to love it as much as we do. Hi everyone, Emily Gracie here. I'm coming to you fresh off of the National Tropical Weather Conference in South Padre Island, where some of the top minds in meteorology gather every year to talk about what's ahead for the hurricane season. It's a great conference where TV and digital meteorologists converge with storm chasers, emergency managers, researchers, and the National Hurricane Center is there as well. New information is shared, collaboration happens across all those groups, and it leads to better ways to communicate risk and ultimately save lives. One of the biggest moments at the conference is always the release of the Colorado State University Seasonal Outlook, a forecast that's been around for decades and has built a reputation as one of the most trusted in the industry. It's a little bit of an NFL draft for the weather community. The room fills up, people are on their phones, cameras are up, and everyone's waiting for the numbers to come out. There's a mix of anticipation and excitement because everyone knows those numbers are going to drive the conversation for the entire season. And it's led by Dr. Phil Klotzbach, who you'll hear from today. In this episode, we're breaking down what CSU is predicting for the 2026 hurricane season, how a developing and possibly strong El Niño could shape storm activity, and what history tells us about where storms are more likely to track depending on those large-scale patterns. We also dig into Phil's research on landfall trends during El Niño versus La Niña, and some of those lesser-known factors that can still tip the balance in a season like this. So whether you live along the Gulf Coast, the East Coast, or you're just trying to stay ahead of the season, this is one conversation you'll want to hear. Here's my chat with Dr. Phil Klotzbach. So 2026 is here. You put out this outlook every year. Tell me what the numbers are.
Yeah, so we're forecasting a slightly below normal hurricane season, a total of 13 named storms. Of those 13, 6 becoming hurricanes, and of those 6, 2 becoming major category 3, 4, 5 hurricanes. Those are hurricanes with winds of 111 miles per hour or greater. For reference, an average season has 14 storms, 7 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes, so 1 fewer of each of those numbers.
It feels like in the past few years, we always hear like above average season. Is that my imagination, or is this kind of like a new concept here where we're actually getting a below average prediction?
Yeah, so, of the last 10 hurricane seasons, 9 have been either above normal or considered hyperactive by NOAA. So people are like, oh, you're forecasting above average season every year. I'm like, well, they've been all above, so why we do. But this year, because of what we think is going to be a moderate to strong El Nino, we are forecasting a slightly below normal season. For reference, we did also forecast a slightly below normal season in April of 2023. We actually ended up with an above normal season that year, so that wasn't one of our best forecasts, but we don't always forecast above normal.
Okay, yeah, I want to dig a little bit into 2023 in a second. Let's go back to the factors that kind of go into this decision-making process. You mentioned one of them there, and we've, even just like in the past day, we've had some kind of breaking developments with ENSO, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so NOAA this morning, like an hour before we put out our forecast, updated their ENSO outlook, and it now says, so we had a weak La Nina, and now we're in neutral conditions. So La Nina is basically the opposite of El Nino. And so we're transitioning away from La Nina. We're in neutral, probably going over to El Nino in the next 2 to 3 months. And so the big question is, how strong is the El Nino going to be? How fast is it going to come on? And so that has pretty significant impacts as to kind of how the season is going to play out. A stronger El Nino that comes on faster is probably going to have more of an impact. And it's really due to changes in that vertical wind shear. So that change in wind speed and direction with height in the atmosphere. Too much shear is good for us, but bad for the hurricane. So kind of remains to be seen exactly when this El Nino comes on, how fast it comes on, and then kind of what impacts it has on that vertical wind shear.
Okay, so the timing is important. What about the certainty of the forecast? Is it just about timing, or is it pretty certain that it is going to be this super El Nino?
I think the intensity of the El Nino is still somewhat up in the air. I've seen several articles talking about, a super El Nino is coming, and then you read the article and they're like, well, maybe, but like the title is more aggressive than what they're actually saying in the article, because it gets clicks that way. But I think, there is still some uncertainty because right now we've had a pretty strong winds blowing across the Pacific that are helping to transport warm water from the Western Pacific towards the Eastern Pacific, which is really kind of what kicks off an El Nino. But do those strong winds persist? Do those dissipate? It still kind of remains to be seen. If those were, say, to weaken substantially, potentially even flip back to more robust winds blowing out of the east, what we call the trade winds, that could potentially cause the El Nino to not be as strong. So just because models are generally very aggressive doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's going to occur.
Gotcha. So you do updates throughout the season too. When can we expect those?
Yeah, so the next update will come out on June the 10th, and by then we'll have a better idea of what this El Nino is. Obviously, if by June 10th we're already in El Nino and things are just going, straight up like that, then, obviously we'd probably lower the numbers. Whereas if the El Nino is kind of thinking around, coming on very slowly and the Atlantic were to warm up much faster than normal, perhaps we would go up. So that's those are two of the big things we're looking at. Also, once you get into May, into early June, we can start kind of assessing kind of what the circulation is looking like over Africa, which is important for the rainfall, and kind of the monsoon that occurs over Africa is a big driver of what we call African easterly waves, which are strong thunderstorm complexes that serve as the seeds for most of your hurricanes.
What happened? Can you dig a little bit deeper into 2023 and what happened there, what the factors were, and kind of that forecast not panning out as planned?
Yeah, so, with the early April update, so we put out our first forecast in April. So in late February, the Atlantic was kind of near average, and we anticipated a pretty strong El Nino. We didn't put out a forecast in March, but if we had done it in March, it would have been really low. But then as we went from in March, the Atlantic started to warm up very, very quickly. And it went from kind of near average at the end of February to record warm by the end of May across a large swath of the basin. And that was due to basically the winds that blow across the tropical Atlantic, what we call the trade winds, basically just collapsed. They were extremely weak for several months. And when those winds are weak, that causes less evaporation, less mixing of the ocean, which allows the ocean to warm very quickly. So if you want to warm an ocean in a very quick amount of time, you basically just kill the wind blowing across the ocean, and that's going to cause the warming. So that's really what we saw. So by our June update, we went for an average season. At that point, we forecast 7 hurricanes, which is actually what we got. The season was we had a lot of storms. We had 20 storms in 2023, which is near record levels. Near record until we had 2020. We had 30 storms, but it was a very high number of storms. We had 7 hurricanes and 3 major hurricanes, which is it's just basically the long-term average. But overall, it met NOAA's definition of an above normal season, which is basically was unprecedented given how robust the El Nino was, but that's because the Atlantic was so warm. The circulation of the tropics was a lot different than what you would typically see in a strong El Nino.
Gotcha. And you are really digging into the research here and looking at even landfalling locations. Can you tell me differences that you've noticed when it comes to where these things make landfall in a La Nina versus El Nino?
Yeah. So what we did a kind of a dive into where these storms make landfall and how where the storms that make landfall, where they form. And so typically El Nino really knocks down your storm formations in the Caribbean, especially in the Caribbean and also in the tropical Atlantic. So if you look at where storms that make landfall in El Nino years, they tend to form maybe say in the Gulf or closer to the US coast. So the odds of those storms reaching really high intensities tends to go down somewhat just because they don't have as much time over warm water as say you do if you get a storm that forms say in the Eastern Caribbean or even east of the islands that may be out there for several days before making landfall. So what you find is that the odds of landfall of a hurricane or a major hurricane are about twice as high in a La Nina relative to an El Nino.
Gotcha. And I know we've been talking about the Atlantic and focusing on that. What about the Pacific? Is there anything you can deduce from this?
Yeah, so typically, assuming we go to an El Nino and a fairly robust one, typically in El Nino years, you tend to get more storms forming in the eastern North Pacific, especially maybe not right off the coast of Mexico, but a little farther to the west. The odds of storms forming there go up quite substantially. The overall the overall wind patterns and the overall shear patterns are more conducive. You tend to get storms making longer tracks across the Pacific, maybe headed towards Hawaii, not guaranteed landfalls because Hawaii's small islands and a very big ocean. It has to kind of approach Hawaii from a certain direction to really cause significant impacts there. But you tend to also get more storms in the eastern part of the western North Pacific, which is west of the international date line. That area tends to get more storms in an El Nino as well. Just the way the monsoon, what we call the monsoon trough, or basically this broad area of rotation that helps to spin up storms in the western North Pacific tends to be very robust in the southeastern part. And that tends to increase your storm formations there. So broadly speaking, usually in an El Nino, you tend to get more storm formations in the southeastern part of the western North Pacific, potentially more threats for places like Japan, and then maybe lower odds for places like in the South China Sea. But there's other stuff that goes on with that as well.
Kind of going to the history of like the CSU outlook in general. How long have you been doing this? Can you talk about a little bit the history of who did it before you and the legacy that this has been passed on?
Yeah, so the seasonal forecast got started all the way back in 1984. So this is our 43rd year of doing seasonal forecasting. So seasonal forecast got started by my mentor at CSU, Dr. Bill Gray. He started these back then. And so he was basically the first guy to do seasonal hurricane predictions for any basin, basically, publicly available. And so what he was doing was looking at basically what we call precursor signals. So he looked and saw, okay, there tends to be one set of conditions prior to busy seasons, a different set before inactive seasons. And so he always wanted to forecast stuff. And so he said, hey, we can do these predictions, so we should do this for the Atlantic. So we started making them publicly available in 1984. So we've been doing this every year since. So he was my mentor. He taught me a tremendous amount about forecasting. But in addition to doing the seasonal forecast, which is kind of how he's best known amongst the general public, he did a lot of research on everything from like the structure of tropical cyclones, like how they look from a lot of like aircraft reconnaissance data. He did a lot with like how tropical cyclones, basically why we get storms where we do, why we don't get storms in say the South, why we don't get storms say off the coast of South America, things like that. He did a lot of research on that as well. So he was, pretty much a giant in the field of hurricane research.
What do you think the value is of this outlook, other than to get the nerds at this conference excited about the season?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of curiosity. People want to know, how busy do you think the season is going to be? And there's things that we can say to basically give you some clues as to how busy the season is going to be. I think also with some of the new models, new research that's being done, we can maybe not necessarily, we're never going to be able to tell you like in April, hey, a hurricane is going to hit one spot, 4 months from now. But what we can do is start to maybe look a little more regionally and say certain regions look more likely, especially where those storms are going to form. In addition, typically our best forecast is the one that we put out in early August, right prior to when the season really ramps up. And so as the forecast models of things like El Nino get better, then we hopefully can get improved skill at basically being able to get what we give you in August now, maybe be able to give you that in July or in June. So that's kind of where we're working as well, to try to kind of push the limits as to when we can start issuing forecasts that have really good levels of skill.
There, where I live in Charleston, South Carolina, there's like this old wives' tale, and I'm curious if there's any truth behind it, of if they get a big hurricane, they think they get snow the following winter. Is there like some sort of scientific backing to that, you think? Can you connect any dots there?
I would think that's probably kind of hard to connect, just given your hurricane's going to be in the summer and the storms occur in the winter. There are definitely ties from like when you get recurving storms that you can get kind of like, for example, past year was a good example. So we had Hurricane Aaron which was a Category 5 hurricane, powerful storm, recurved off the coast of the Carolinas. Didn't cause much in the way of impacts, but basically after that storm recurved, the big kind of low pressure area dug into the southeast U.S. and it was, for southeast U.S., it was a fairly benign summer, like it wasn't stupid hot. And that was one of the reasons why we didn't really see much in the way of impacts to the U.S. last year, was because that area of low pressure kind of helped both steer the storms out to sea, but also helped to shear them off. So I don't think there's much necessarily with like saying, okay, a hurricane in September is going to make for a snowstorm in January, but certainly recurving storms can cause changes in the pattern that can make things either more or less conducive for storms later on during the season.
Interesting. Very, very cool.
Yeah.
Has anybody gotten into like weather betting the way they do with like sports betting?
Oh yeah, for sure.
So do people hit you up like as we go into the season wanting to know what's going on with
I haven't seen, there's definitely betting markets out there for weather. No one's asked me for like insider information on those, but there definitely are even on seasonal forecasts, there are definitely bets on, and it's interesting to kind of watch how they ebb and flow. Yeah. People will sometimes, at least my view is the betting community will sometimes overreact and be like, oh my gosh, like 2024, for example, like, oh, the season, like everyone's like, oh, we're betting low now because like we had that big lull and then all hell broke loose at the end of the season. We end up with 11 hurricanes. Sorry. So yeah, it is interesting to kind of watch how that works. But yes, people will bet on anything. So
yep, it will. Well, that's all I got, Bill.
Cool.
Thanks so much. Appreciate your time.
Of course, thank you.
Yeah. Off the Radar is a production of the National Weather Desk. Make sure you're following the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes published every Tuesday. Also, give us a follow on Instagram. You'll see clips from the show and other great weather content. Just search Off the Radar Podcast. Thanks to Dr. Phil Klotzbach from Colorado State University for joining me today, and a huge thanks to the organizers of the National Tropical Weather Conference, Alex Garcia, Bill Reed, and Tim Smith. They put on an amazing conference every year, and if you're a meteorologist covering tropical weather or interested in learning more about hurricanes, I highly recommend you attend. Thanks to the National Weather Desk and Sinclair Broadcast Group for their ongoing support of the podcast, and to Brian Petrus for his help with today's episode. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie. Make it a great day.